Welcome to the Irish Revolution. Many historians regard the war as having only really started in January of 1920, when IRA GHQ formally authorised attacks on the RIC. The general public tend to think that the start date of the War of Independence was 21st of January 1919, when the Tipperary IRA killed 2 RIC men and when Dáil Éireann officially declared its independence. But the violence in 1919 was sporadic and paled in comparison with what would come in 1920. As the violence intensified across the country, many individual IRA men went on the run to avoid the police. As more and more fugitives were living by bouncing from house to house, the flying columns formed quite organically, strengths in numbers and all that, as well as camaraderie. These small groups would be readily available to help out local units for operation. These men would form the nucleus of the flying columns. GHQ in Dublin quickly recognised their potential and started encouraging their formation across the country. The first flying columns would form in the most active areas with the most men on the run, such as in Cork this month. Just Auguste Heen, a venerable historian whose name I clearly can't pronounce, considers the 9th of August 1920 to be a watershed moment in the conflict. This was when the British government introduced the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act, which allowed for internment and court-martial of civilians. The immediate consequence of this was a large number of arrests of IRA officers, and a lot more men would be forced to go on the run. They would form many flying columns across the country. Without intending to, the British escalated the conflict in huge and unforeseen ways. How did the flying columns operate? Well, as I said before, they were composed of permanent fighters, men on the run. Instead of a part-time force who'd come together for occasional attacks, the IRA now had a core group of fighters whose full-time occupation was finding ways to ambush and attack Crown forces. I'd strongly recommend reading accounts by some of the men who fought in flying columns on the Bureau of Military History's website. Oh, and everyone interested in this period also needs to read Tom Barry's Memoir. Just remember, people were making this up as they went along. It wasn't really the kind of model for this kind of warfare, so it was all new. Moving on now to the Belfast Boycott. The events of June and July 1920 shocked the rest of Ireland, which was horrified by the sight of sectarian carnage and expulsions of Catholic workers in the north. Informal boycotts against unionist businesses were arranged at a local level this month, starting with a pledge from Galway city shopkeepers who would refuse to sell anything that originated from Belfast. This boycott was then argued for by Sean McEntee within the Dáil, one of the few senior Republicans who was also a Northerner. The Dáil government then agreed to a formal boycott, albeit reluctantly. Robert Lynch argues that the boycott in fact achieved little and was actually quite damaging, as it made northeastern Ulster even more commercially dependent on the link with Britain. It failed to make much of an impact on the engineering and shipbuilding industries, where most of the expulsions took place. Furthermore, the expulsions alienated moderate unionist opinion and gave greater leverage to the hardline unionist position, making reinstatement of Catholic workers impossible without a major volte-face from the most extreme voices. Lynch further argues that it contributed to the partition of the economy, with many Belfast-based banks forced to close branches outside what would become the future Northern Ireland. In fact, the businesses hardest hit by the boycott were those who had nothing to do with the expulsions, deepening their alienation and sense of otherness from the rest of the country. Industry where Catholics suffered most barely noticed the boycott. Not many southern farmers and carpenters were in the habit of buying warships and cruise liners. Enforcement of the boycott would be divisive and heightened sectarian tensions across the country. The infamous blacklist appeared, and intimidation of traders by the IRA was widespread. In some places, such as Strabane and Cookstown in County Tyrone, IRA men even attacked the Catholic employees of boycotted businesses. Arson attacks were common. 800 were recorded in the first 6 months in 1921 alone. The boycott would become very important to Sinn Féin policy up to the start of the Civil War, and would only end with Collins' agreement with the Northern Premier James Craig in March 1922. Although the anti-treaty IRA reimposed it almost immediately in areas where they were strong, they would enforce it even more harshly than the pre-truce IRA. And to finish off today, I'm going to do a mini biography of Archbishop Daniel Mannix of Melbourne, who was refused entry to Ireland this month and who was sympathetic to the Republican cause and a thorn in the side of the British establishment. Mannix would stay on in Britain, much to the annoyance of several cabinet ministers. Daniel Patrick Mannix was the Irish-born Archbishop of Melbourne, Australia. Mannix was born in Charleville, County Cork, and was president of St Patrick's College, Maynooth, the National Seminary, from 1903 to 1912. Mannix was then made a bishop in Melbourne. Catholics were treated with suspicion by the Anglican and Presbyterian majority, and Mannix immediately became a controversial figure in Australia by arguing on behalf of a segregated sectarian education system in opposition to the secular model of education prevailing in Australia. Mannix was originally quite opposed to militant Irish nationalism, but seems to have had a change of heart around the time of the Terence MacSwiney hunger strike. On his way to visit Ireland, he travelled through the United States, where he made what Prime Minister Lloyd George considered to be extreme speeches, extreme enough that George refused his entry to Ireland. He was also refused entry to British cities with large Irish populations. Ultimately, he spent a lot of the War of Independence in and around the town of Penzance in Cornwall, where presumably there weren't too many Irishmen. Okay, thanks for watching. Good luck now. Bye.